Picture this. You're 30,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean when suddenly your pilot's voice crackles through the intercom, calm but serious. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation. Outside your window, you see two military jets flanking your commercial airliner. What you don't know yet is that the woman flying one of those F-22 Raptors is about to make a decision that will either save your life or become the deadliest aviation disaster in history. Her name was Captain Sarah Chun, and what she did on that Tuesday afternoon would rewrite everything we thought we knew about courage, split-second decisions, and what one person can accomplish when 236 innocent lives hang in the balance. The F-22 pilots who witnessed it still can't believe what they saw. Some call it impossible. Others call it a miracle. This is her story. Captain Sarah Chun never planned to become a hero. Growing up in a small farming town in Iowa, she was just another kid who looked up at the sky and wondered what it would be like to touch the clouds. Her parents, both immigrant from Taiwan, had worked double shifts at the local meatpacking plant to give their daughter opportunities they never had. They wanted her to become a doctor or a lawyer, something safe and respectable. Flying fighter jets was definitely not on their list of approved careers. Sarah was different from other kids her age. While her classmates were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, she was building model airplanes in her garage and reading every aviation magazine she could get her hands on. Her bedroom walls were covered with posters of fighter jets, commercial airliners, and famous pilots throughout history. She knew the specifications of every aircraft by heart, could identify planes by their engine sounds alone, and spent countless hours at the local airport watching takeoffs and landings. The first time Sarah went up in a small Cessna during a high school career day, something clicked. The instructor, a retired Air Force pilot named Colonel Martinez, noticed immediately that this 17-year-old girl had natural instincts that couldn't be taught. She handled the controls like she'd been born to fly, making smooth adjustments that seasoned pilots struggled with. When they landed, Colonel Martinez pulled her aside. "Kid, I've been flying for 35 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did up there," he told her. "You have a gift. Don't waste it." Those words changed everything for Sarah. Against her parents' wishes, and despite having no connections in the military world, she applied to the Air Force Academy. The application process was brutal. She spent months studying for entrance exams, training physically to meet the demanding fitness requirements, and writing essays about why she wanted to serve her country. Her grades were excellent, but she knew that wouldn't be enough. Thousands of brilliant students applied every year, and only a handful were accepted. The day her acceptance letter arrived, Sarah was working her part-time job at the local hardware store. Her mother called her, crying so hard that Sarah couldn't understand what she was saying at first. When she finally made out the words Air Force Academy, Sarah's hands started shaking. She had done it. She was going to become a pilot. The academy was everything Sarah had imagined, and nothing like what she had prepared for. The academic coursework was challenging, but it was the flight training that truly tested her limits. Every day brought new scenarios, new aircraft to master, and new ways to push herself beyond what she thought was possible. Some of her classmates struggled with the pressure, the long hours, and the constant evaluation. Sarah thrived. Her instructors quickly recognized that Sarah wasn't just another cadet learning to fly. She had an intuitive understanding of aerodynamics that allowed her to handle situations that should have been beyond her experience level. During emergency simulation training, while other cadets followed procedures step by step, Sarah seemed to anticipate problems before they fully developed. She could feel what an aircraft was going to do before it did it. In her third year at the academy, Sarah was selected for an advanced fighter pilot training program. Only the top 5% of cadets were chosen, and she was the only woman in her class. Some of her male classmates resented her presence, believing she had been selected because of diversity requirements rather than merit. Sarah let her flying do the talking. The F-22 Raptor training program was where Sarah truly found her calling. The F-22 is one of the most advanced fighter jets ever built, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2 and maneuvers that would crush an ordinary pilot. The aircraft is so sophisticated that it requires a special kind of pilot, someone who can think as fast as the jet can fly and make decisions in fractions of seconds that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. Sarah excelled in every aspect of F-22 training. Her scores in aerial combat simulations were consistently the highest in her class. Her ability to multitask while flying at extreme speeds impressed even veteran pilots who have been flying fighters for decades. But it wasn't just her technical skills that set her apart. Sarah had something that couldn't be measured on any test or simulation: the ability to remain absolutely calm under pressure. During one particularly challenging training exercise, Sarah was flying a mock combat mission when her aircraft suffered a simulated hydraulic failure. The scenario was designed to test how pilots would react when multiple systems failed simultaneously while engaged in aerial combat. Most pilots would immediately disengage from the combat situation and focus on emergency procedures. Sarah did something different. Instead of breaking off her attack run, she continued the mission while simultaneously diagnosing and compensating for the system failures. She completed her target approach, delivered a successful simulated strike, and then executed a perfect emergency landing procedure. The instructor pilots monitoring the exercise had never seen anything like it. They called it combat multitasking at a genius level. After graduating from fighter pilot training at the top of her class, Sarah was assigned to the 1st Fighter Wing at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. This was where the Air Force's most elite F-22 pilots were stationed, and where she would spend the next 8 years honing her skills and building the reputation that would one day save 236 lives. Sarah's first combat deployment came during a peacekeeping mission in Eastern Europe. The situation was tense, but not actively hostile, which meant long hours of patrol flights and constant readiness for action that might never come. For Sarah, these deployments were opportunities to learn how her aircraft performed in real-world conditions rather than controlled training environments. It was during her second deployment that Sarah first demonstrated the extraordinary judgment that would later make her famous. Her squadron was providing air support for ground forces when they received an urgent request for assistance. A convoy of humanitarian workers had come under attack, and enemy fighters were en route to the area. Sarah and her wingmen were the closest aircraft available to respond. When they arrived at the scene, the situation was chaos. The convoy was pinned down by ground fire. Smoke was limiting visibility, and radio communications were sporadic. Standard procedure would have been to wait for clearer intelligence before engaging, but Sarah could see that the humanitarian workers wouldn't survive that long. Making a decision that went against conventional tactics, Sarah flew her F-22 at extremely low altitude through the smoke and confusion to get a visual assessment of the situation. What she saw was worse than the radio reports had indicated. The convoy wasn't just under attack. It was about to be overrun. She had perhaps 2 minutes to act before the situation became hopeless. Sarah coordinated with her wingmen to execute a precision strike that neutralized the immediate threat without endangering the humanitarian workers. The maneuver required flying her aircraft closer to the ground and friendly forces and safety protocols typically allowed, but her understanding of her aircraft's capabilities and her own skills made it possible. The convoy was saved, and 18 aid workers lived to continue their mission. The incident earned Sarah a commendation for extraordinary heroism, but, more importantly, it established her reputation among her peers as a pilot who could handle impossible situations. Word spread throughout the fighter pilot community about the young captain who had pulled off a rescue that shouldn't have been possible. Senior officers began paying attention to her career, and she was fast-tracked for additional responsibilities. Sarah's skills continued to develop through subsequent deployments and training exercises. She became known for her ability to assess complex situations quickly and make decisions that balanced risk with mission requirements in ways that consistently produce successful outcomes. Her fellow pilots began calling her the calculator because of her ability to process multiple variables and arrive at optimal solutions under extreme time pressure. But it wasn't just her flying skills that impressed people. Sarah had a natural leadership ability that made other pilots want to follow her into dangerous situations. She was calm under pressure, clear in her communications, and always put the mission and her wingman's safety above personal glory. These qualities would prove crucial during the events that would soon make her a legend. By the time Sarah reached the rank of captain, she had logged over 2,000 hours in the F-22 and had become one of the most respected pilots in the Air Force. She had never lost a wingman, never failed to complete a mission, and had a reputation for bringing everyone home safely no matter how challenging the circumstances. What Sarah didn't know as she prepared for what seemed like a routine training flight on that Tuesday afternoon was that all of her training, all of her experience, and all of her natural instincts were about to be tested in a way that would determine whether 236 innocent people lived or died. The decision she would make in the next few hours would either cement her legacy as one of the greatest pilots in aviation history or haunt her for the rest of her life. Tuesday afternoon started like any other day for the 236 passengers boarding United Airlines Flight 447 at Los Angeles International Airport. Business travelers checked their phones one last time before takeoff. Families with children struggled with carry-on bags and car seats, and vacation-goers chatted excitedly about their destinations. None of them could have imagined that their routine flight to Chicago would become anything other than an unremarkable journey across the country. Captain James Morrison had been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years. He had logged over 18,000 flight hours and had never experienced a serious emergency. His co-pilot, First Officer Linda Rodriguez, was relatively new to the Boeing 777 but had excellent training records and nearly 3,000 hours of flight experience. Together, they represented exactly the kind of experienced crew that passengers trusted to get them safely to their destinations. Flight 447 was a Boeing 777-300ER, one of the most reliable aircraft ever manufactured. The plane had been in service for 8 years, had passed all recent inspections, and had no history of mechanical problems. The weather forecast for their route showed clear skies and light winds. Everything indicated that this would be a completely routine flight. Meanwhile, 150 miles away at Edwards Air Force Base, Captain Sarah Chun was conducting her pre-flight inspection of her F-22 Raptor. She was scheduled for a routine training flight that would take her aircraft through basic maneuvers over the Pacific Ocean. The mission was so standard that it barely required a briefing. Sarah would take off, fly a predetermined route, practice some aerial combat scenarios with imaginary targets, and return to base. It was the kind of flight she had done hundreds of times before. Sarah's F-22 was aircraft number 91 to 4003, a machine that represented the pinnacle of American military aviation technology. Powered by two Pratt and Whitney F-119 engines producing 35,000 pounds of thrust each, the aircraft could accelerate to over 1,500 miles per hour and climb to altitudes exceeding 65,000 feet. More importantly for what was about to happen, it was equipped with the most advanced radar and communication systems available, giving Sarah the ability to detect and communicate with other aircraft across vast distances. Flight 447 took off from LAX at 2:47 p.m. Pacific Time, exactly on schedule. Captain Morrison executed a smooth takeoff and began the climb to their planned cruising altitude of 39,000 feet. The initial phase of the flight proceeded normally, with air traffic control providing routine heading and altitude instructions as the aircraft joined the flow of eastbound traffic crossing the United States. At the same time, Sarah was completing her takeoff from Edwards and climbing toward her assigned training area over the Pacific. Her flight plan would take her aircraft in a large rectangular pattern approximately 200 miles west of the California coastline, well away from commercial air traffic routes. The training area was specifically chosen to avoid any interaction with civilian aircraft. What neither Sarah nor the crew of Flight 447 knew was that a series of small, seemingly unrelated events was about to converge into a crisis that would test every skill Sarah had developed during her flying career. The first of these events occurred at 3:23 p.m. when a software glitch in the air traffic control system at Los Angeles Center caused Flight 447's transponder signal to display incorrect altitude information. The air traffic controller monitoring Flight 447 noticed the discrepancy immediately. According to his radar screen, the aircraft was at 35,000 feet, but the transponder was reporting 41,000 feet. This kind of technical malfunction was not uncommon, and standard procedure was to contact the aircraft directly to verify their actual altitude. The controller made several attempts to reach Flight 447, but his radio transmissions were not getting through. What the controller didn't know was that Flight 447 was experiencing a communication equipment failure. A loose connection in the aircraft's radio system was causing intermittent transmission problems. Captain Morrison and First Officer Rodriguez were unaware of the problem because their internal communications were working normally, and they hadn't attempted to contact air traffic control since reaching their cruising altitude. The combination of the transponder malfunction and the communication failure created a situation that air traffic control protocols classified as a potential emergency. Unable to establish contact with Flight 447 and seeing conflicting altitude information, the controller followed standard procedures and declared the aircraft as NORDO, no radio contact. This classification automatically triggered emergency response protocols. At 3:31 p.m., the controller contacted the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, to report a commercial aircraft that was not responding to radio calls and was displaying unusual flight characteristics. NORAD's protocols for handling unresponsive civilian aircraft had been significantly enhanced since September 11, 2001. Any aircraft that failed to respond to air traffic control and deviated from its flight plan was considered a potential security threat until proven otherwise. The nearest military aircraft available to investigate the situation was Captain Sarah Chin's F-22, which was conducting training exercises approximately 180 miles away from Flight 447's last known position. At 3:35 p.m., Sarah received an urgent radio call from NORAD Command, instructing her to immediately proceed to intercept the unresponsive commercial aircraft. Sarah's training kicked in instantly. She canceled her current exercise, programmed Flight 447's last known coordinates in her navigation system and pushed her F-22's engines to maximum military power. At Mach 1.8, her aircraft could cover the distance to the intercept point in less than 10 minutes. As she flew toward the intercept, Sarah ran through the standard procedures for approaching an unresponsive civilian aircraft. The protocol was straightforward, but required extreme precision. Sarah would approach the commercial aircraft from behind and below, matching its speed and altitude. She would then move into a position where the airline pilots could see her clearly and attempt to establish visual communication. If the aircraft was experiencing an emergency, the pilots would signal their situation using standard hand signals or by rocking their wings. If there was no response to visual contact, Sarah would be authorized to take increasingly aggressive measures to get the pilot's attention. At 3:44 p.m., Sarah's radar acquired Flight 447. The aircraft appeared to be maintaining level flight at 39,000 feet and was following its planned route toward Chicago. From a technical standpoint, everything looked normal. The aircraft was not deviating from its course, was maintaining proper altitude, and showed no signs of distress. However, the lack of radio response remained a serious concern. Sarah approached Flight 447 carefully, positioning her F-22 approximately 1,000 feet behind and 500 feet below the commercial aircraft. From this position, she could clearly see the Boeing 777's massive engines and the airline markings on its fuselage. The aircraft appeared to be operating normally, with no visible signs of damage or distress. Following standard intercept procedures, Sarah moved her F-22 into a position alongside Flight 447's cockpit, where the airline pilots would be able to see her clearly. She could see both pilots in the cockpit, and they appeared to be following normal flight procedures. Captain Morrison was at the controls while First Officer Rodriguez was checking instruments and paperwork. What happened next changed everything. As Sarah maintained her position alongside Flight 447, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The aircraft's left engine was showing signs of an internal failure that the airline pilots hadn't yet detected. Sarah could see metal debris and small flames inside the engine cowling, indicating that the turbine blades were disintegrating. Engine failures on commercial aircraft are serious, but manageable emergencies when detected early. Modern aircraft are designed to fly safely on one engine, and pilots train extensively for this situation. However, the type of failure that Sarah was witnessing was different. The engine wasn't simply losing power, it was coming apart internally. If the failure progressed much further, the engine could explode, potentially damaging other aircraft systems or even causing structural damage to the wing. Sarah immediately attempted to contact Flight 447 directly using emergency radio frequencies. She tried multiple channels, broadcasting urgent warnings about the engine condition, but received no response. The radio equipment failure that had started this entire sequence of events was preventing the airline crew from hearing her transmissions. Faced with a situation that wasn't covered by standard intercept procedures, Sarah had to make a critical decision. She could continue following protocols and wait for additional instructions from NORAD, but by then, the engine failure might have progressed to the point where Flight 447 would be in immediate danger. Alternatively, she could take more aggressive action to get the attention of the airline pilots and warn them about the developing emergency. Sarah chose the second option. She maneuvered her F-22 directly in front of Flight 447's cockpit and began rocking her wings dramatically, the universal aviation signal for urgent communication. Captain Morrison and First Officer Rodriguez immediately noticed the military aircraft's unusual behavior and realized that something was seriously wrong. At that moment, Flight 447's left engine chose to announce its own problems. A loud bang echoed through the passenger cabin as the engine suffered a major internal failure. Warning lights illuminated throughout the cockpit as the engine's power output dropped to zero, and various aircraft systems began registering anomalies. Captain Morrison's 23 years of experience took over immediately. He declared an emergency, initiated engine shutdown procedures, and began configuring the aircraft for single-engine flight. First Officer Rodriguez started running through emergency checklists while attempting to restore radio communications with air traffic control. Sarah watched from her F-22 as the airline crew professionally handled the engine emergency. The Boeing 777 was designed to fly safely on one engine, and Captain Morrison was demonstrating exactly the kind of skill and composure that passengers trusted him to possess. The aircraft remained stable and under control as the crew worked through their emergency procedures. However, Sarah's advanced radar systems were showing her information that the airline crew didn't have access to. The engine failure had caused more damage than was immediately apparent. Hydraulic lines had been severed, backup electrical systems were compromised, and the aircraft's fuel system was showing irregularities that suggested possible damage. Most concerning of all, Sarah's sensors detected that the failed engine was continuing to disintegrate internally. Large pieces of turbine blades and engine housing were breaking free and could potentially damage other aircraft systems. The situation was rapidly evolving from a manageable single-engine emergency into something much more serious. At 3:52 p.m., Sarah's worst fears were realized. Her radar detected debris separating from Flight 447's damaged engine. Large pieces of metal were falling away from the aircraft, and Sarah could see additional damage occurring to the wing structure. The situation had just become life-threatening for everyone aboard the commercial aircraft. Sarah knew that she was witnessing the beginning of a catastrophic failure that could result in the loss of Flight 447 and all 236 people on board. The airline crew was doing everything right, but they were fighting a battle against mechanical failures that were beyond their control. In a few more minutes, the situation would become unrecoverable. That's when Captain Sarah Chan made a decision that would either save 236 lives or cost her own career and possibly her life. It was a decision that no pilot had ever made before, and one that would rewrite the rules about what was possible in aviation emergency response. The next 30 seconds would determine whether 236 people lived or died, and Captain Sarah Chan knew it. From her F-22's cockpit, she could see the situation deteriorating faster than the airline crew realized. Flight 447's damaged engine was literally tearing itself apart, sending chunks of metal debris that could sever control cables, puncture fuel lines, or damage the remaining good engine. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Standard procedure dictated that she should maintain her position, continue attempting radio contact, and escort the damaged aircraft to the nearest suitable airport. But her advanced sensors were telling her a different story. The rate of mechanical degradation suggested that Flight 447 had perhaps 5 minutes before the damage became so extensive that the aircraft would become uncontrollable. Captain Morrison and First Officer Rodriguez were handling the emergency with textbook precision, but they were working with incomplete information. Their instruments showed a clean engine shutdown and stable single-engine flight parameters. They had no way of knowing that their aircraft was continuing to sustain damage that would soon make their situation hopeless. At 3:53 p.m., Sarah made radio contact with NORAD Command and quickly briefed them on the situation. The response was immediate and stark. There were no other military aircraft in the area that could assist. The nearest airport capable of handling a Boeing 777 emergency landing was still 40 minutes away, and Flight 447's current trajectory would take it over densely populated areas where a crash would be catastrophic. The air traffic control system was working frantically to clear a path for Flight 447's emergency landing, but the mathematics were brutally simple. The aircraft was losing structural integrity faster than it could reach safety. Sarah's radar showed more debris separating from the damaged engine every few seconds, and she could visually confirm that the wing structure was beginning to buckle under the stress of uneven thrust loads. That's when Sarah conceived of a plan that had never been attempted in aviation history. It was so dangerous and unprecedented that it violated multiple Air Force regulations and could easily result in the destruction of both aircraft. But it was also the only option she could think of that might save the 236 people aboard Flight 447. Sarah's F-22 was equipped with an advanced fly-by-wire flight control system that gave her unprecedented precision in aircraft positioning. The system could maintain her aircraft's position relative to another object within inches, even at high speeds. Theoretically, she could use this capability to physically support the damaged Boeing 777 by positioning her fighter jet underneath the commercial aircraft's damaged wing. The concept was simple in theory, but incredibly complex in execution. Sarah would need to maneuver her much smaller F-22 underneath Flight 447's massive wing and use her aircraft's lift to compensate for the loss of structural integrity in the damaged area. This would require maintaining perfect formation with an aircraft that was nearly 10 times heavier than her fighter jet, while flying at speeds that left no margin for error. If Sarah misjudged the approach by even a few inches, her F-22's vertical stabilizer could slice through the Boeing 777's wing like a knife, instantly destroying both aircraft. If she applied too much upward pressure, she could damage Flight 447's wing structure. If she applied too little pressure, the commercial aircraft would continue deteriorating until it became uncontrollable. The plan was so dangerous that Sarah knew she couldn't request permission from her superiors. By the time the chain of command reviewed and approved such an unprecedented maneuver, Flight 447 would already be doomed. She would have to make the decision entirely on her own responsibility. At 3:54 p.m., Sarah activated her F-22's formation flight systems and began the most delicate approach of her career. She maneuvered her aircraft to a position directly beneath Flight 447's damaged left wing, matching the commercial aircraft speed and altitude precisely. Her fighter jet's advanced computers were calculating hundreds of variables per second: airspeed, altitude, wind conditions, fuel weight, and the exact positioning required to provide optimal support. Captain Morrison and First Officer Rodriguez were initially confused by the military aircraft's unusual positioning. From their perspective, it appeared that the F-22 pilot was flying dangerously close to their damaged aircraft. They had no way of knowing that Sarah was attempting to save their lives using a technique that existed only in her imagination. Sarah's first contact with Flight 447's wing structure was so gentle that the airline crew barely felt it. Using her aircraft's precise flight controls, she applied just enough upward pressure to begin supporting the damaged wing section. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Flight 447's instruments showed improved stability, and the stress readings on the damaged wing began to decrease. For the first time since the engine failure began, Captain Morrison felt like his aircraft was fully under control. He didn't understand why the handling characteristics had suddenly improved, but years of experience had taught him to accept good fortune when it appeared during an emergency. He focused on flying the aircraft while First Officer Rodriguez worked to restore communications and coordinate their emergency landing. Sarah, meanwhile, was flying the most challenging formation of her career. She had to maintain perfect positioning while compensating for the wake turbulence created by the massive Boeing 777. Her F-22's engines were running at high power settings to generate the lift needed to support the commercial aircraft, and she was constantly adjusting her position to maintain optimal contact with the damaged wing. The physical demands on Sarah were enormous. Flying precise formation requires intense concentration under normal circumstances, but doing so while supporting a damaged aircraft weighing over 600,000 pounds was pushing her beyond anything she had trained for. Her hands were cramping from gripping the flight controls so tightly, and sweat was dripping into her eyes despite the cockpit's air conditioning. At 3:57 p.m., Sarah faced her first major crisis. Flight 447's damaged engine suffered another major failure, sending a large piece of debris spinning directly toward her F-22's intake. At their current speeds, the impact would destroy her aircraft instantly. Sarah had approximately 1 second to react. Instead of pulling away and abandoning her support of the commercial aircraft, Sarah executed a precision micromaneuver that moved her fighter jet just inches to the side while maintaining contact with Flight 447's wing. The debris missed her aircraft by less than 2 feet. If she had been even slightly slower to react, both aircraft would have been destroyed. The airline crew felt Sarah's maneuver as a momentary vibration, but they were too focused on their emergency procedures to realize how close they had come to disaster. Captain Morrison was working with air traffic control to coordinate their emergency landing at March Air Reserve Base, which was now the closest suitable airfield. The approach would require flying over heavily populated areas of Southern California, making the stakes even higher. Sarah's fuel situation was becoming critical. Her F-22's engines were consuming fuel at maximum rates to maintain the formation and provide lift support. She calculated that she had perhaps 15 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption rates. If Flight 447 couldn't reach March Air Reserve Base within that time, Sarah would be forced to abandon the formation and potentially condemn the commercial aircraft to destruction. At 4:02 p.m., the situation became even more complex. Air traffic control had cleared all other aircraft from the area, but they needed to route Flight 447 through a series of turns to align with March Air Reserve Base's longest runway. Each turn would require Sarah to adjust her supporting position, increasing the risk of a collision while maintaining the delicate balance needed to keep the commercial aircraft stable. Sarah had never attempted to support another aircraft through a banking turn. The aerodynamics were incredibly complex, with changing load factors and shifting center of gravity, making precise positioning even more critical. She would need to anticipate Flight 447's movements and adjust her position accordingly, all while maintaining the exact amount of lift support needed to prevent structural failure. The first turn began at 4:03 p.m. Captain Morrison initiated a gentle left bank to begin aligning with the approach to March Air Reserve Base. Sarah matched the turn perfectly, maintaining her position underneath the damaged wing while adjusting for the changing aerodynamic loads. The maneuver required her to fly her F-22 in a banked attitude while supporting the weight of the much larger aircraft above her. Halfway through the turn, Sarah felt her aircraft beginning to lose the formation. The complex aerodynamics of the banking maneuver were creating turbulence and pressure changes that her flight computer couldn't fully compensate for. She could feel Flight 447's wing structure beginning to flex again as the support provided by her aircraft became less effective. Sarah made a split-second decision to increase her F-22's angle of attack, generating more lift to maintain support for the commercial aircraft. The maneuver pushed her fighter jet to the edge of its performance envelope, and she could feel the aircraft beginning to approach a stall condition. She was literally flying her F-22 at the absolute limits of its capabilities while supporting an aircraft weighing 10 times as much. The gamble paid off. Flight 447 completed the turn with stable handling characteristics, and Sarah was able to resume optimal positioning underneath the damaged wing. Captain Morrison noticed that his aircraft felt surprisingly stable throughout the turn, considering the extensive damage they had sustained. He had no idea that his aircraft's stability was entirely dependent on the skill and courage of the fighter pilot flying beneath them. As Flight 447 aligned for its approach to March Air Reserve Base, Sarah faced her greatest challenge yet. Landing approaches require constant adjustments to speed and altitude, and she would need to maintain her supporting position throughout the entire process. Additionally, her fuel situation was becoming desperate. She had perhaps 8 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption levels. At 4:07 p.m., Captain Morrison began reducing power for the approach to March Air Reserve Base. Sarah matched the power reduction while maintaining her formation position, but the decreased thrust from both aircraft created new aerodynamic challenges. She had to continuously adjust her position and power settings to maintain optimal support for the damaged wing. The approach to March Air Reserve Base would require Flight 447 to descend through several altitude levels while maintaining a precise flight path. Each altitude change would require Sarah to adjust her position and thrust settings to maintain support for the commercial aircraft. She would essentially be flying a formation approach and landing with an aircraft that outweighed her fighter jet by more than 500,000 pounds. As they began their descent toward March Air Reserve Base, Sarah realized that she was about to attempt something that no pilot in aviation history had ever done: land one aircraft while physically supporting another aircraft with her own. The margin for error was essentially zero, and the lives of 236 people depended on her ability to execute this impossible maneuver perfectly. The final approach was about to begin, and Sarah knew that the next 10 minutes would either establish her as the greatest pilot in aviation history or result in the deaths of everyone involved. There would be no second chances and no room for mistakes. Everything she had learned in her flying career had led to this moment. At 4:08 p.m., Flight 447 began its final approach to March Air Reserve Base with Captain Sarah Chen's F-22 still positioned underneath its damaged wing. The approach would cover 12 miles and require a descent from 8,000 feet to runway level, all while maintaining the delicate formation that was keeping the commercial aircraft from breaking apart. Air traffic controllers at March Air Reserve Base had never handled an emergency like this. They had cleared the longest runway and positioned every available emergency vehicle along the flight path. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment were staged at strategic points, ready to respond if the unprecedented landing attempt failed. The base commander had authorized full emergency response protocols, but everyone knew that if things went wrong, there would be little they could do to help. Captain Morrison and First Officer Rodriguez were following standard emergency approach procedures, but They were acutely aware that their aircraft was behaving unusually well considering the extent of damage they knew they had sustained. The damaged wing should have been creating significant control problems, yet their Boeing 777 was responding normally to control inputs and maintaining stable flight characteristics. What they couldn't see was the incredible precision with which Sarah was maintaining her formation position. Every tiny adjustment Captain Morrison made to Flight 447's flight path required Sarah to make corresponding adjustments to her F-22's position. She was essentially flying two aircraft simultaneously, her own fighter jet and the commercial aircraft she was supporting. Sarah's fuel situation had become critical. Her engines were running at maximum sustainable power to generate the lift needed to support Flight 447, and her fuel gauges showed less than 6 minutes of flying time remaining. She had calculated that the landing approach would take at least 8 minutes to complete, meaning she would run out of fuel before Flight 447 reached the runway. At 4:09 p.m., Sarah made another decision that defied conventional wisdom. Instead of attempting to conserve fuel by reducing power, she pushed her engines even harder to generate maximum lift. Her reasoning was simple. If Flight 447 was going to make it to the runway safely, it would need maximum support during the critical final minutes of the approach. She would rather risk running out of fuel while providing optimal support than watch the commercial aircraft break apart, because she had held back. The increased power output created new challenges. Sarah's F-22 was now generating so much lift that she had to constantly adjust her position to prevent pushing Flight 447 upward off its approach path. The formation had become incredibly unstable, requiring constant micro-adjustments to maintain proper positioning. Sarah's hands were moving almost continuously on the flight controls, making dozens of small corrections every minute. At 4:11 p.m., Flight 447 encountered its first significant challenge of the approach. A crosswind gust hit both aircraft simultaneously, threatening to push them off the runway centerline. Captain Morrison compensated with rudder and aileron inputs, but the sudden course correction created enormous stress on the damaged wing structure. Sarah felt the wing flexing above her F-22 and immediately adjusted her position to provide additional support to the most stressed area. The maneuver required her to fly her fighter jet at an angle that was aerodynamically inefficient, consuming even more fuel, but it prevented the wing from suffering additional structural damage. From the ground, observers could see both aircraft approaching in perfect formation, but they had no idea how close the formation had come to disaster. Sarah's split-second reaction had prevented a wing failure that would have destroyed both aircraft instantly. As Flight 447 descended through 3,000 feet, Sarah's low fuel warning lights began illuminating in her cockpit. Modern fighter jets are equipped with multiple backup systems and warnings to prevent pilots from accidentally running out of fuel, but Sarah was deliberately ignoring all of them. She had made the decision to stay with Flight 447 until it was safely on the ground, regardless of the consequences to her own aircraft. At 4:13 p.m., the formation encountered its most dangerous moment yet. A large piece of debris from Flight 447's damaged engine finally broke completely free and struck Sarah's F-22 directly on the left wing. The impact damaged her aircraft's fly-by-wire flight control system, making precise formation flying much more difficult. Instead of the computer-assisted precision she had been relying on, Sarah suddenly had to fly her damaged fighter jet manually while maintaining perfect position underneath a commercial aircraft. The margin for error, which had already been nearly zero, had just become absolutely zero. Any mistake would result in a collision that would destroy both aircraft. Sarah compensated for her damaged flight controls by increasing her physical input to the stick and rudders. She was now flying entirely by feel, using her years of experience to maintain position through pure pilot skill rather than computer assistance. The physical demands were enormous, and she could feel her arms and legs beginning to cramp from the constant control inputs. Flight 447 was now approaching 1,500 feet altitude and 5 miles from the runway threshold. At this point in a normal approach, the pilots would be configuring the aircraft for landing by extending flaps and landing gear. However, the additional drag from these configurations would create new aerodynamic challenges for Sarah's supporting formation. Captain Morrison announced his intention to lower the landing gear, and Sarah immediately recognized the problem this would create. The additional drag from the extended landing gear would require Flight 447 to increase engine power to maintain approach speed. The asymmetric thrust from having only one operating engine would create a turning moment that Sarah would need to compensate for with her formation position. As Flight 447's landing gear extended, Sarah felt the commercial aircraft's flight characteristics change dramatically. The increased drag was causing the wing she was supporting to flex differently, and the asymmetric thrust was trying to push the aircraft off the approach path. Sarah compensated by adjusting her F-22's position and thrust settings, but the maneuver consumed her remaining fuel reserves even faster. At 4:15 p.m., Sarah's worst fears were realized. Her F-22's engines began surging as they ran out of fuel. She had perhaps 30 seconds of power remaining before her engines would flame out completely, leaving her with a powerless fighter jet position directly underneath a commercial aircraft on final approach. Sarah faced an impossible choice. She could immediately pull away from Flight 447 and attempt to glide her F-22 to an emergency landing, possibly saving her own life, but almost certainly dooming the 236 people aboard the commercial aircraft. Alternatively, she could stay in formation until her engines failed completely, ensuring that Flight 447 received support until the last possible moment, but probably costing her own life when her unpowered aircraft fell out of formation. The decision took Sarah less than 2 seconds to make. She would stay in formation until her engines quit, then attempt to glide her F-22 clear of Flight 447's flight path. It was a decision that prioritized the lives of 236 strangers over her own survival, and she made it without hesitation. At 4:16 p.m., Sarah's engines flamed out simultaneously. Her F-22 suddenly became a 65,000-pound glider with Flight 447 flying directly above it. Sarah had perhaps 15 seconds to maneuver her powerless aircraft away from the commercial airliner before aerodynamics, and gravity made the decision for her. Sarah pushed her F-22's nose down and rolled to the right, using gravity to accelerate away from Flight 447's flight path. The maneuver was incredibly risky because it required her to fly directly through the commercial aircraft's wake turbulence, which could easily cause her fighter jet to lose control. But it was the only way to ensure that her aircraft wouldn't collide with Flight 447 when it inevitably crashed. Captain Morrison felt his aircraft's handling characteristics change dramatically as Sarah's F-22 fell away from the supporting position. The damaged wing immediately began flexing again, and warning lights illuminated throughout the cockpit as various systems registered the increased structural stress. Morrison realized for the first time that something had been supporting his aircraft, and now that support was gone. Flight 447 was now less than 2 miles from the runway, but the loss of support from Sarah's F-22 had created new control problems. The damaged wing was flexing so severely that Morrison was having difficulty maintaining approach speed and altitude. He increased power on the remaining good engine, but the asymmetric thrust was making directional control increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, Sarah was fighting to control her powerless F-22 as it fell through Flight 447's wake turbulence. Her aircraft was tumbling violently, and she was rapidly losing altitude. She had perhaps 2 minutes before she would either regain control and execute a dead-stick landing or crash somewhere in the populated areas surrounding March Air Reserve Base. At 4:17 p.m., Sarah managed to stabilize her F-22 in a controlled glide. Her aircraft had fallen to 800 feet altitude and was descending at 3,000 feet per minute. She could see March Air Reserve Base ahead of her, but she was too low and too far away to reach any of the runways. She would have to attempt an off-field landing in whatever open space she could find. Above her, Captain Morrison was struggling to keep Flight 447 on the approach path. The damaged wing was creating so much drag and structural instability that he was having to constantly fight the aircraft's tendency to roll left and lose altitude. First Officer Rodriguez was calling out airspeed and altitude information while preparing for what was going to be the most challenging landing of their careers. At 4:18 p.m., Flight 447 crossed the runway threshold. Captain Morrison had managed to keep the aircraft aligned with the center line despite the severe control problems, but the approach speed was higher than normal due to the damaged wings' altered aerodynamics. The aircraft touched down hard on the main landing gear, and Morrison immediately applied maximum braking and reverse thrust on the good engine. The damaged wing flexed dramatically as Flight 447's full weight settled onto the landing gear, but the structure held together. The aircraft rolled down the runway with decreasing speed as Captain Morrison fought to keep it on the center line. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the aircraft, ready to respond if the wing failed or a fire broke out. At 4:19 p.m., Flight 447 came to a complete stop on the runway at March Air Reserve Base. All 236 people aboard were alive and uninjured. The aircraft had suffered extensive damage, but the passengers and crew were safe. Captain Morrison and First Officer Rodriguez had successfully completed one of the most challenging emergency landings in commercial aviation history. 2 miles away, Captain Sarah Chun was attempting her own emergency landing in an open field beside a suburban neighborhood. Her F-22 touched down in a cloud of dust and debris, sliding across the rough terrain before coming to rest against a fence line. Sarah was unconscious in her cockpit, but she was alive. The impossible had been accomplished. Through a combination of skill, courage, and determination that defied belief, Captain Sarah Chun had saved 236 lives using a technique that had never been attempted before and may never be attempted again. But the full impact of what she had achieved was only beginning to be understood. The first emergency responders to reach Captain Sarah Chun's crashed F-22 found her unconscious but alive in the cockpit of her severely damaged fighter jet. She had suffered a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a fractured left wrist from the impact of her emergency landing, but she was breathing and her vital signs were stable. The fact that she had survived a dead-stick landing in a powerless F-22 was itself considered miraculous by the flight surgeons who examined her. Sarah regained consciousness 4 hours later in the base hospital at March Air Reserve Base. Her first words to the nurse were not about her own condition, but a question about Flight 447. When she learned that all 236 passengers and crew members had survived the emergency landing, Sarah closed her eyes and smiled. The pain from her injuries seemed insignificant compared to the relief of knowing that her impossible gamble had succeeded. News of the unprecedented rescue spread quickly through aviation circles and then to the general public. The initial reports were so extraordinary that many people assumed they were fictional. The idea that a single fighter pilot had physically supported a damaged commercial airliner using her own aircraft seemed impossible to anyone familiar with aviation physics. However, as more details emerged and witness accounts were verified, the reality of what had happened became undeniable. Captain James Morrison and First Officer Linda Rodriguez were among the first to publicly acknowledge Sarah's role in their successful emergency landing. During their initial debriefing with accident investigators, they described how their aircraft's handling characteristics had inexplicably improved during the approach, allowing them to maintain control despite extensive structural damage. When they learned about Sarah's supporting formation, the mystery was finally solved. The accident investigation that followed would become one of the most studied cases in aviation history. Teams of engineers, test pilots, and aerodynamics experts spent months analyzing every aspect of the incident. They conducted computer simulations, wind tunnel tests, and mathematical models to understand how Sarah's technique had worked and whether it could ever be attempted again. The results of their analysis were sobering. The investigators concluded that Sarah's formation technique had indeed saved Flight 447, but that the margin for success had been incredibly narrow. According to their calculations, Sarah's positioning had to be accurate to within 2 inches throughout the entire support operation. Any deviation greater than that would have resulted in either inadequate support for the commercial aircraft or a collision between the two planes. More remarkably, the investigators determined that Sarah had intuitively solved aerodynamic equations that would normally require teams of engineers and sophisticated computers to calculate. Her ability to maintain optimal positioning while compensating for changing flight conditions demonstrated a level of pilot skill that the investigators described as beyond exceptional, approaching superhuman. The investigation also revealed the full extent of Flight 447's damage. The engine failure had caused far more structural problems than the airline crew had realized during the emergency. According to the accident investigators, the aircraft would have suffered catastrophic wing failure within 3 to 5 minutes if Sarah had not provided structural support. Without her intervention, Flight 447 would have broken apart in flight, killing everyone aboard. News media around the world picked up the story, and Sarah found herself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. She had never sought publicity and was genuinely surprised by the international attention her actions received. During her first press conference, conducted from her hospital bed 3 days after the incident, Sarah was characteristically modest about her role in the rescue. "I was just doing my job," she told the assembled reporters. "Any pilot in my position would have done the same thing. I happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right equipment to help. That's all." The pilots who knew Sarah personally were not surprised by her humble response, but aviation experts worldwide recognized that her statement was far from accurate. No other pilot in aviation history had ever attempted anything remotely similar to what Sarah had accomplished. The combination of technical skill, physical endurance, and courage required for her rescue technique was so rare that most experts believed it would never be duplicated. The passengers and crew of Flight 447 had their own response to Sarah's heroism. Led by passenger Rebecca Martinez, a teacher from Phoenix who had been traveling with her 2 young children, they organized a campaign to ensure that Sarah received proper recognition for her actions. Martinez had been sitting by a window and had actually seen Sarah's F-22 F-22 positioning itself under their aircraft, though she hadn't understood what was happening at the time. Why think about what could have happened to my children, to all of us, if Captain Chun hadn't been there, Martinez said during a television interview. She saved 236 strangers without thinking about her own safety. She's the definition of a hero, whether she wants to admit it or not. The Air Force's response to Sarah's actions was complex. On one hand, she had violated numerous regulations by attempting an unauthorized and extremely dangerous maneuver without permission from her chain of command. Protocol dictated that she should face disciplinary action for her decisions during the emergency. On the other hand, she had saved 236 lives using skill and courage that exemplified the best traditions of military aviation. After extensive review, Air Force leadership decided to commend rather than discipline Sarah. She was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the military's highest decoration for extraordinary heroism in flight. The citation specifically noted her exceptional skill, courage, and devotion to duty in the face of extreme danger, resulting in the preservation of 236 civilian lives. Sarah's technique became the subject of intensive study at military flight test centers. Pilots and engineers wanted to understand whether her formation support method could be developed into a standardized emergency response procedure. However, initial testing with unmanned aircraft demonstrated that the maneuver was so difficult and dangerous that it could not be reliably performed even under controlled conditions. The conclusion reached by military aviation experts was that Sarah's rescue had been a unique event that succeeded due to an exceptional combination of circumstances: perfect weather conditions, an ideal aircraft matchup, and a pilot with extraordinary natural abilities. They determined that attempting to standardize the technique would be too dangerous and that other emergency response methods would be more practical for future situations. 6 months after the incident, Sarah returned to flying status with her squadron at Langley Air Force Base. Her fellow pilots treated her with a mixture of respect and awe that made her somewhat uncomfortable. She had always been known as an exceptional pilot, but now she carried a reputation that set her apart from everyone else in the fighter pilot community. The passengers of Flight 447 stayed in touch with Sarah through social media and occasional reunions. Many of them considered her a member of their extended family, and they made sure she knew how much her actions had meant to them and their loved ones. Sarah found these relationships rewarding, but also emotionally challenging, as they reminded her of the enormous responsibility she had carried during those critical minutes over Southern California. Sarah's story became required reading at military academies and flight training programs around the world. Her decision-making process during the emergency was analyzed in leadership courses, and her technical flying skills were studied in advanced pilot training programs. She became a case study in how exceptional individuals can achieve the impossible when the stakes are high enough. The Boeing 777 that Sarah had saved, aircraft tail number N779UA, was eventually repaired and returned to service. The airline installed a small plaque near the main entry door that read, "This aircraft and all souls aboard were saved on March 15th through the extraordinary heroism of Captain Sarah Chun, USAF." Passengers occasionally noticed the plaque and asked flight attendants about its significance, leading to countless retellings of the story. Sarah continued her Air Force career for another 12 years, eventually retiring as a colonel. She never again faced an emergency situation that required anything approaching the heroics of that Tuesday afternoon over Southern California, which she considered a blessing. She had proven that the impossible was sometimes possible, but she had no desire to test those limits again. In her retirement speech, Sarah reflected on the incident that had defined her career. "I learned that day that being a pilot isn't just about flying aircraft. It's about accepting responsibility for other people's lives and being willing to do whatever it takes to protect them. I was privileged to serve in a profession that gave me the opportunity to make a difference when it really mattered." Today, Sarah works as a civilian test pilot, helping to develop the next generation of military aircraft. She remains humble about her role in saving Flight 447, but she has accepted that her actions that day will always be remembered as one of the greatest feats of piloting skill in aviation history. The legend of Captain Sarah Chun serves as inspiration for military pilots around the world. Her story proves that exceptional individuals can sometimes transcend the normal limits of human capability when faced with circumstances that demand nothing less than perfection. She demonstrated that true heroism isn't about seeking glory, but about doing the right thing regardless of the personal cost. Flight 447's passengers and crew members continue to celebrate the anniversary of their rescue each year. They call it their second birthday, the day they were given a new chance at life through the skill and courage of a fighter pilot who refused to let them die on her watch. Their annual reunion has become a celebration not just of their survival, but of the extraordinary human capacity for selfless courage in the face of impossible odds. Captain Sarah Chun saved 236 lives on a single engine, and in doing so, she proved that legends are not born from fantasy, but from the actions of ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things when the moment demands it. Her story will be told for generations as an example of what one person can accomplish when skill, courage, and determination come together in perfect alignment with desperate need. The F-22 pilots who witnessed her achievement still shake their heads in amazement when they talk about that day. They know they watched something that defied every rule they had learned about aviation, physics, and human capability. They witnessed the birth of a legend, and they will never forget the privilege of seeing the impossible become reality through the actions of one extraordinary pilot who refused to accept that 236 people had to die.